Sometimes the most brilliant solutions come from the most unexpected places. In our world of advanced degrees, expensive suits, and corner offices, we often forget that wisdom doesn't always wear a tie. This is the remarkable true story of how a nighttime janitor named Marcus Williams became the hero of one of the most complex real estate deals in corporate history, and how his simple observation changed everything for everyone involved. What you're about to read challenges everything we think we know about expertise, intelligence, and the value of different perspectives. It's a story that will make you question whether we're looking for answers in all the wrong places, and whether the people we overlook might be the ones holding the keys to our biggest problems. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune in the 42nd floor conference room of Davidson, Pierce & Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. It was nearly midnight on a Thursday in October, and the room looked like a battlefield. Empty coffee cups lined the mahogany table like fallen soldiers. Legal documents were scattered across every surface, some highlighted in yellow, others marked with red ink that looked almost angry in its urgency. 10 of the city's brightest legal minds sat around that table, their expensive suits wrinkled from 14 hours of continuous work. Their eyes were bloodshot, their voices hoarse from endless debate. They had been hired by Meridian Corporation to handle what should have been a straightforward real estate merger, the acquisition of a chain of luxury hotels across 3 states. The deal was worth $2.8 billion, and it was falling apart. Sarah Chun, the lead attorney, rubbed her temples as she stared at the mountain of contracts before her. She had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, had been named one of the top mergers and acquisitions lawyers under 40 by Legal Times magazine, and had successfully closed deals worth over $50 billion in her career. But this case was different. This case was breaking her. "Let's go through it one more time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The team had been over the documents hundreds of times, but they kept hitting the same wall. Somewhere in the maze of property deeds, zoning regulations, and title transfers, there was a problem that threatened to kill the entire deal. The issue centered around a small piece of land in downtown Phoenix, just 2 acres that sat between the main hotel property and a parking structure. According to the documents, Meridian Corporation owned the land. But according to other documents, equally official and equally valid, the city of Phoenix owned it. And according to a third set of documents, it belonged to a Native American tribe that had sold it to the state of Arizona in 1923. "It's impossible," muttered David Rodriguez, a specialist in property law who had flown in from Los Angeles specifically for this case. 3 different entities can't own the same piece of land. The paperwork has to be wrong somewhere, but I've checked every document 5 times. The signatures are real, the notarizations are valid, the filing dates are all correct. Jennifer Walsh, an expert in Native American law, shook her head in frustration. "I've traced the tribal claim back to the original treaty documents. Everything checks out on their end, too. The tribe did own the land, and they did sell it to the state in 1923. But somehow the state also granted a deed to the city in 1924, and the city sold it to a private developer in 1967. And that developer's company was eventually acquired by what became Meridian Corporation. So we have a chain of legitimate ownership going back 90 years, said Thomas Kim, who specialized in municipal law. But we also have 2 other chains of equally legitimate ownership for the same property. It's like the land exists in 3 different legal realities at the same time. The problem wasn't just academic. Without clear title to that 2-acre plot, the entire hotel couldn't be sold. The parking structure couldn't function without access through that land. The city had already approved zoning changes based on the assumption that they controlled the property. The tribe was threatening to file an injunction claiming their original sale was invalid due to a technicality in federal law that wasn't discovered until 1994. And Meridian Corporation's buyers were threatening to walk away from the entire $2.8 billion deal if the title issue wasn't resolved by Friday morning. Michael Patterson, the firm's senior partner, stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city lights. He had built his reputation on solving impossible cases, on finding solutions when everyone else had given up. But he was out of ideas. "We've consulted with historians, we've brought in experts on federal Indian law, We've had 3 different title companies examine the chain of ownership. Everyone agrees that all 3 claims appear to be legally valid. It's impossible, but it's happening. The team had explored every legal avenue they could think of. They had researched court cases going back to the territorial period. They had studied federal treaties, state laws, municipal ordinances, and county records. They had created timeline charts and ownership trees and legal flowcharts that covered an entire wall of the conference room. But nothing worked. "What about adverse possession?" suggested Lisa Martinez, one of the junior associates. It was a legal principle that said if someone had been using land openly and continuously for a certain period of time, they could claim ownership even without a deed. "Already considered it," replied David. "The problem is that all 3 parties have been using the land in some capacity for decades. The city has been maintaining the sidewalks and utilities. The tribe has been conducting ceremonial activities there twice a year since 1987, and Meridian's predecessors have been treating it as part of their property and paying taxes on it since 1971. "Quiet title action?" asked another associate, referring to a court proceeding that could potentially settle disputed ownership. "Would take 2 years minimum," said Sarah. "The deal dies tomorrow morning if we don't have an answer. Could we partition the land somehow? Divide it between the 3 parties?" 2 acres isn't big enough to partition meaningfully, and none of the 3 parties would accept a partial ownership solution anyway. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Technically, it was now Friday, the day the deal would either close or collapse. The team had been working around the clock for 6 days straight. They had consumed gallons of coffee, ordered enough takeout food to feed a small army, and collectively billed more than 800 hours to this single case. "Maybe we're overthinking this," said Jennifer, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe there's a simple solution we're missing because we're too deep in the details." "Like what?" asked Michael. "We've examined every angle. We've read every relevant law, every court case, every regulation. The problem isn't that we don't understand the law. It's that the law itself is contradictory here." "What if we could prove one of the documents is fraudulent?" suggested Thomas. "We've had forensic document examiners look at everything," replied Lisa. "No forgeries, no alterations, no backdated signatures. Every document is exactly what it appears to be." Sarah stood and walked to the whiteboard where they had mapped out the 3 competing ownership claims. Red lines showed the tribal claim, blue lines showed the city's claim, and green lines showed Meridian's claim. The lines intersected and overlapped in ways that shouldn't have been legally possible. "You know what's driving me crazy?" she said. "It's not just that we can't solve this. It's that I feel like we're missing something obvious. Like there's a simple answer right in front of us that we can't see because we're looking too hard." The other lawyers nodded. They all had the same feeling, that nagging sense that the solution was hiding in plain sight. But after 6 days of intensive analysis, none of them could imagine what that solution might be. David pulled up the survey maps on his laptop for what felt like the 1,000th time. "Let's go back to the basics. We have 2 acres of land. It sits at coordinates 33.4457 north, 112.0672 west. The northern boundary is East Jefferson Street. The southern boundary is East Washington Street. The eastern boundary is 2nd Avenue. The western boundary is 1st Avenue. We verified those coordinates 100 times, said Jennifer wearily. "I know, but sometimes you have to state the obvious to see what you're missing." David zoomed in on the satellite image. The land is currently occupied by a small park with walking paths, some trees, and a memorial statue commemorating Arizona's statehood. Right? The statue was erected by the city in 1962 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of statehood. That's one of the things that supports the city's ownership claim. But the tribe says they never gave permission for the statue, which supports their claim that the original sale was invalid. And Meridian says the statue sits on their property, which means the city was trespassing when they built it. Michael returned to his seat at the head of the table. "Let's try a different approach. What if we accept that all 3 parties have legitimate claims? What would that mean legally?" "It would mean we're in uncharted territory," said Thomas. "I've never seen a case where 3 parties had equally valid claims to the same property. There has to be precedent somewhere. We've searched. The closest case was in Montana in 1987, where two parties had competing claims based on a surveying error. But that was just two parties, and one of the claims was clearly based on a mistake. This is different. What about international law? Are there cases where multiple nations claim the same territory? Sure, but those are resolved through treaties or conquest, not property law. And we're not dealing with sovereign nations here. Well, the tribe technically is a sovereign nation. True, but they're also subject to federal oversight, and the federal government already acknowledged the validity of their 1923 sale. The lawyers continued their circular debate, revisiting the same arguments and reaching the same dead ends. Meanwhile, the clock continued to tick toward morning, toward the deadline that would determine whether a $2.8 billion deal lived or died. In another part of the building, 42 floors below, Marcus Williams was beginning his shift. Marcus was 57 years old, a tall, lean man with graying hair and hands that showed the wear of 30 years of honest work. He had been the night janitor at Davidson, Pierce & Associates for 7 years, arriving every night at 11 p.m. and working until 7 a.m., cleaning offices, emptying trash cans, and maintaining the spotless appearance that the law firm's wealthy clients expected. Marcus had grown up in South Carolina, the son of a sharecropper and a seamstress. He had been a good student in high school, with particular strengths in mathematics and history. His teachers had encouraged him to apply to college, but his family couldn't afford the tuition, and scholarship opportunities for black students were limited in the small town where he lived. Instead, he had joined the Army after graduation, serving 2 tours in Vietnam as a radio operator and map reader. After his military service, Marcus had worked a series of jobs: construction, factory work, security guard, maintenance technician. He had never made a lot of money, but he had always been reliable, always been respected by his co-workers and supervisors. When his wife died of cancer 12 years ago, he had moved to New York to be closer to his daughter and granddaughter. The janitor job at the law firm paid well enough for him to afford a small apartment in Queens, and it included health insurance, which was important for a man his age. Marcus took pride in his work. He knew that the lawyers depended on him to maintain their professional environment, and he never let them down. He was usually invisible to them. They worked during the day, he worked at night, but he occasionally saw them during his shift when they stayed late for important cases. Tonight was clearly one of those important cases. As Marcus stepped off the elevator on the 42nd floor, he could see lights on in the main conference room and hear the murmur of voices. He had noticed the lawyers working late all week, and from the amount of trash he had been emptying from their conference room, he could tell they were under tremendous pressure. Marcus began his usual routine, starting with the offices along the perimeter of the floor. He emptied wastebaskets, dusted furniture, vacuumed carpets, and cleaned windows. He worked methodically and quietly, taking care not to disturb the lawyers in the conference room. He had learned over the years that they appreciated his discretion during late-night sessions. As he worked, Marcus couldn't help but overhear fragments of the lawyers' conversation. They seemed to be discussing some kind of land ownership problem. He heard mentions of Phoenix, Arizona, Native American tribes, and property deeds. It sounded complicated, but then, again, everything the lawyers dealt with sounded complicated to Marcus. By 2 a.m., Marcus had finished cleaning most of the floor and was ready to tackle the conference room area. The lawyers were still hard at work, surrounded by papers and computers and the kind of intense energy that comes from a looming deadline. Marcus knocked gently on the door and poked his head inside. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I need to empty the trash," and CL Marcus Williams had always been good with maps. During his time in Vietnam, he had been responsible for plotting coordinates and tracking troop movements across terrain that could mean the difference between life and death. You learned to pay attention to details when getting them wrong could get people killed. Now, as he quietly emptied wastebaskets around the conference table, those same skills were automatically kicking in. The lawyers were so deep in their legal arguments that they didn't notice Marcus studying the survey maps spread across the table. But Marcus was noticing things that seemed important. The first thing that caught his attention was the difference between two maps that were supposed to show the same piece of land. One was clearly modern, printed on crisp white paper with precise computer-generated lines. The other was obviously much older, yellowed with age, with hand-drawn boundary lines that had been carefully inked decades ago. Both maps claimed to show the same 2 acres in downtown Phoenix. Both had the same coordinate numbers written in the corners. But the boundary lines didn't match exactly. The difference was subtle, maybe 20 or 30 feet in one corner. But Marcus's trained eye caught it immediately. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, interrupting the lawyer's discussion. "I don't want to bother you, but I couldn't help noticing these maps here." The lawyers looked up, their exhausted faces showing mild surprise that the janitor was speaking to them about their case. Sarah managed a tired smile. "What about them, Marcus?" "Well, I used to read a lot of maps in the Army, and these 2 here don't quite match up." Marcus pointed to the area where the boundaries diverged. "This modern one shows the eastern boundary running straight down 2nd Avenue. But this older map shows it angling off about 30 feet to the west right here at the southern corner." David Rodriguez, the property law specialist, glanced at the maps with polite but skeptical interest. "The difference you're seeing is probably just due to changes in surveying technology. The older maps weren't as precise as modern GPS measurements." "Maybe," said Marcus, nodding respectfully. "But I was wondering, do you know exactly when this older map was made?" Jennifer Walsh picked up the older survey document and examined the notation in the corner. "This one is dated 1924. It was part of the original city survey when they were establishing the downtown grid system." "And when was the newer one made?" "The modern survey was done in 1987 when the property was last transferred." Marcus studied both maps again, his mind working through the implications. "So there's a 63-year difference between these surveys. And in that time, the boundary line moved about 30 feet. Like I said," David repeated, "surveying technology improved dramatically over those decades. The newer map is definitely more accurate." But Marcus was thinking about something else entirely. He had noticed a detail that the lawyers had overlooked, something that wouldn't matter to people who were focused on legal ownership, but could be crucial to someone who understood practical land use. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said. "This disputed land, is it flat, or does it have any elevation changes?" The lawyers exchanged glances. After 6 days of intensive legal research, no one had really thought about the physical topography of the land in question. "I'm not sure," admitted Sarah. "Why do you ask?" "Well, if there were any significant elevation changes, like a hill or a creek or something, it might explain why the boundary lines are different in these maps. Sometimes old surveys followed natural features that aren't there anymore." Thomas Kim pulled up a current satellite image of the area on his laptop. "It looks pretty flat from this view. Just a small park with walking paths, and that statehood memorial statue." But Marcus was studying the older map more carefully now, and he noticed something else. There were faint markings on the 1924 survey that looked like topographical indicators, the kind of lines surveyors use to mark elevation changes or water features. "Can you zoom in on this area here?" Marcus asked, pointing to a section of the older map. "These squiggly lines look like they might be marking a creek or a drainage ditch." Jennifer leaned over to look where Marcus was pointing. "You're right. Those do look like water feature markings. But there's no creek there now." "No, but there might have been one in 1924. A lot of urban creeks got buried or diverted when cities expanded." Michael Patterson, the senior partner, was beginning to pay closer attention to the conversation. Something about Marcus's observations was triggering an instinct that had served him well throughout his career, the feeling that an important insight was emerging from an unexpected source. "Marcus," Michael said, "you mentioned you read maps in the Army. What kind of training did you have?" "I was a radio operator and navigator, sir. We had to plot coordinates for artillery support and helicopter landings. You learn to read terrain pretty carefully when people's lives depend on getting the location exactly right." "And you think there might have been a creek running through this property in 1924? "I think it's possible. These markings on the old map definitely indicate some kind of water feature. And if there was a creek there, it might explain the discrepancy between the old and new boundary lines." Sarah was beginning to see where Marcus's thinking might be headed. "You mean the old survey might have used the creek as a natural boundary marker?" "Exactly. Before GPS and modern surveying equipment, land boundaries were often defined by natural features, rivers, ridgelines, distinctive trees. If there was a creek running through this area, the 1924 survey might have set the property line along the creek bed. But if the creek was later buried or diverted, continued David, following the logic, then the modern survey would have had to estimate where the boundary should be, using only the legal description from the old deed. And they might have estimated wrong, concluded Jennifer. Marcus nodded. It's just a guess, but it might be worth checking. Do you have any historical records that might show what this area looked like back in the 1920s? The lawyers exchanged looks. In 6 days of intensive research, they had examined countless legal documents, court cases, and property records. But none of them had thought to investigate the historical geography of the area. We could check the city archives, suggested Lisa Martinez. They might have old photographs or engineering drawings from when the downtown area was being developed. The Arizona Historical Society might have records too, added Thomas. And the Army Corps of Engineers definitely would, if there was any significant water management in that area. Michael stood up from his chair, feeling energized for the first time in days. You know what? This is the first new angle we've had all week. Even if it doesn't solve our ownership problem, it might give us some additional information to work with. But even if we prove there was a creek there, said David, playing devil's advocate, how does that help us resolve the competing ownership claims? Marcus thought about that question for a moment. Well, I don't know much about law, but it seems to me that if the original boundary was set incorrectly because of changes to the land, then maybe all the subsequent property transfers were based on wrong information. Sarah felt a spark of excitement. You're thinking that if the creek was diverted after the 1924 survey, then every subsequent deed and transfer might have been misdescribing the actual property boundaries, which could potentially invalidate some of the ownership claims, added Jennifer. Or at least give us grounds for a more detailed title examination, said Michael. Thomas was already pulling up contact information on his phone. I can call the city archives first thing in the morning. They open at 8. The Arizona Historical Society opens at 9, said Lisa. I can handle that. And I'll contact the Army Corps of Engineers, offered David. If there was significant water management or flood control work in that area, they'll have records going back to the early 1900s. Marcus finished emptying the last wastebasket and prepared to move on to his other duties. I hope I didn't waste your time with all this. I just noticed the maps didn't match up, and it reminded me of some situations we dealt with in Vietnam where land features had changed over time. Marcus, said Sarah firmly, you absolutely did not waste our time. You've given us the first new lead we've had all week. If this pans out, added Michael, we're going to owe you more than just our thanks. As Marcus left the conference room to continue his cleaning duties, the lawyers remained behind, suddenly, energized despite their exhaustion. For the first time in 6 days, they had a concrete line of investigation to pursue. You know what's amazing about this? Said Jennifer. We've been so focused on the legal history of the property that we never considered its physical history. It's the classic forest for the trees problem, agreed David. We were so deep in the details that we couldn't see the bigger picture. And it took someone with no legal training at all to point out what we were missing, said Thomas. Sarah was studying the old survey map with renewed interest, paying attention to details she had previously ignored. Look at this more carefully. Marcus was right. These are definitely topographical markings. And here, along what should be the eastern boundary, there's a series of curves that definitely suggest a water feature. If there was a creek there, it would explain a lot, said Michael. Creek beds were commonly used as property boundaries in early surveys because they provided obvious, permanent markers. But creeks aren't permanent, pointed out Lisa. They change course, they get diverted for development, they get buried under cities. Exactly. So if the creek was diverted sometime after 1924, then every subsequent property transfer would have been based on a boundary description that no longer matched the physical reality. David was running calculations in his head. The discrepancy Marcus noticed was about 30 feet. If the original boundary ran along a creek bed, and the creek was later diverted, that's exactly the kind of measurement error you might see in later surveys. Which means the actual legal boundary might be different from what everyone has assumed for the past 90 years, concluded Jennifer. But we still need to prove that the creek existed when it was diverted, and What that means for the current ownership claims, cautioned Thomas. One step at a time, said Michael. First, let's see what the historical records show. If Marcus is right about the creek, it could change everything. The lawyers spent the next hour developing a research plan for the morning. They would split up and contact different historical archives, looking for any documentation of water features in the downtown Phoenix area during the 1920s and 1930s. They would also need to find out if and when any creeks or drainage channels were diverted or buried during urban development. But even as they planned their research strategy, all of them were thinking the same thing. A night janitor with no legal training had spotted something that 10 experienced lawyers had missed. It was humbling, but it was also a reminder of why fresh perspectives were so valuable in complex problem solving. At exactly 8 a.m. on Friday morning, Thomas Kim was standing outside the Phoenix City Archives, laptop bag in hand, waiting for the doors to open. He had caught the first flight out of LaGuardia at 6 a.m., dozed fitfully during the 4-hour journey, and grabbed a taxi straight from the airport. The $2.8 billion deal had less than 12 hours left, and their only hope now rested on a janitor's observation about some squiggly lines on a 90-year-old map. Back in New York, the rest of the legal team was pursuing other leads. Lisa Martinez was on the phone with the Arizona Historical Society. David Rodriguez was trying to reach someone at the Army Corps of Engineers who might have records of water management projects in the Phoenix area. Jennifer Walsh was contacting local historians and geography professors who might know about changes to the downtown Phoenix landscape over the decades. Sarah Chun had remained in the conference room all night, surrounded by every piece of documentation they had gathered over the past week. She had arranged everything chronologically, creating a timeline that started with the original 1890s territorial surveys and continued through to the present day. If Marcus was right about a creek running through the disputed property, there should be some trace of it in the official records. At 8:15 a.m., Thomas was sitting at a desk in the Phoenix City Archives, explaining his urgent situation to Margaret Collins, the head archivist. Margaret was a woman in her 60s who had worked with the city records for over 30 years. She had heard many urgent requests from lawyers over the decades, but the story Thomas told her was unlike any she had encountered. So you're looking for evidence of a creek that may have run through downtown in the 1920s, Margaret said, reviewing Thomas's request. Based on an observation made by a janitor in New York who noticed discrepancies in old survey maps. I know it sounds unusual, Thomas admitted, but we've exhausted every other avenue. This is our last hope. Margaret smiled. Honey, I've been doing this job for 3 decades. The unusual requests are often the most interesting ones. And you're in luck. We have extensive records of the downtown development from that period, including engineering surveys and flood management studies. She led Thomas to a section of the archives dedicated to early Phoenix urban planning. In the 1920s, downtown Phoenix was still being developed from what was essentially desert. There were several seasonal washes and creek beds that had to be managed as the city expanded. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Washes and creek beds? Oh yes. Before air conditioning and modern water management, the early settlers built their communities around natural water sources, even seasonal ones. Let me show you something. Margaret pulled out a large bound volume labeled Phoenix Municipal Engineering Survey 1923 to 1925. She opened it to a detailed map of the downtown area that showed not just streets and property boundaries, but also natural features that no longer existed. Here, she said, pointing to a thin blue line that wound through what was now the heart of downtown Phoenix. Salt Creek. It was a seasonal waterway that ran roughly northwest to southeast through the area you're interested in. During the spring snowmelt and summer monsoon season, it carried significant water flow. The rest of the year, it was mostly dry, but there were pools that provided water for wildlife and early settlers. Thomas stared at the map, hardly believing what he was seeing. The blue line ran directly through the coordinates Marcus had identified on the disputed property. When was this creek diverted or buried? Margaret flipped through several pages of engineering documents. According to these records, the city began major drainage modification projects in 1926. Salt Creek was diverted into underground storm drains as part of a flood control initiative. The surface channel was filled in and incorporated into the street grid. So in 1924, when the original property survey was done, the creek would have been flowing on the surface. Absolutely. And look here, Margaret pointed to a notation on the engineering drawings. The city survey from 1924 specifically mentions using the eastern bank of Salt Creek as a reference point for establishing property boundaries in that area. Thomas felt a rush of excitement that was almost dizzying. Marcus had been right. There had been a creek running through the disputed property, and the original 1924 survey had used it as a boundary marker. When the creek was diverted 2 years later, all subsequent surveys would have had to estimate where the boundary should be. Can I get copies of these documents? Thomas asked. Absolutely. I'll have them scanned and emailed to you within the hour. But let me show you one more thing that might be helpful. Margaret led Thomas to another section where aerial photographs were stored. We have some early aerial photos from the 1930s, after the creek was diverted. You can actually see the filled-in channel in some of these images. She pulled out a black and white photograph taken in 1932. Even to Thomas's untrained eye, the path of the former creek was clearly visible as a slightly different shade and texture running through the urban landscape. The filled-in channel created a subtle but distinct line that matched exactly with the squiggly markings Marcus had noticed on the old survey map. This is incredible, Thomas said. This proves that the natural boundary feature existed when the original survey was done, and that it was artificially altered afterward. It also shows that anyone trying to locate the original boundary line without knowing about the creek would likely get it wrong, Margaret added. They'd have to guess based on the legal description, and if that description referred to a geographic feature that no longer existed, they'd be off by exactly the kind of distance we've been seeing in our property dispute. Thomas immediately called Sarah in New York, who put him on speakerphone so the entire legal team could hear the update. We've got it, Thomas announced. Marcus was absolutely right. There was a creek running right through the disputed property, Salt Creek. It was used as a boundary marker in the 1924 survey, then diverted underground in 1926. Every subsequent survey had to estimate where the boundary should be, and they estimated wrong. The conference room in New York erupted in a mixture of relief and amazement. After 6 days of legal dead ends, they finally had a concrete explanation for the ownership confusion. This is brilliant, said Sarah. But how does it help us resolve the competing claims? That's where it gets interesting, Thomas continued. If the original boundary was set using the creek as a reference point, and if all the subsequent property transfers were based on surveys that didn't account for the creek's diversion, then we might be dealing with a systematic error that affected multiple properties over several decades. David Rodriguez, who had been listening intently, immediately grasped the implications. You're saying that not just our disputed property, but potentially dozens of properties in that area might have incorrect boundary descriptions in their deeds. Exactly. And if that's the case, then none of the current ownership claims are necessarily invalid. They're just based on incorrect boundary information. Jennifer Walsh was already thinking through the legal ramifications. So instead of 3 parties fighting over the same piece of land, we might actually be looking at a situation where each party owns a legitimate piece of property, but the boundaries have been wrong for 90 years. Which would mean the solution isn't to determine who has the valid claim, concluded Michael Patterson, but to resurvey the area using the correct boundary information and redistribute the ownership accordingly. Lisa Martinez had been quietly taking notes throughout the conversation. But would all 3 parties accept a solution like that? They've all been assuming they own specific coordinates for decades. They might, said Sarah, especially if the alternative is a lengthy court battle that could take years to resolve and might leave them with nothing. Thomas was still in Phoenix, photographing documents and gathering as much evidence as possible. I'm getting copies of everything. The original engineering surveys, the flood control project records, the aerial photographs that show the filled-in creek bed. We'll have enough documentation to prove exactly where the original boundary should be. The question now, said David, is whether we can get a new survey done and agreements from all 3 parties before our deadline this afternoon. Michael was already reaching for his phone. I'll call the principals and explain the situation. If they understand that we've found a way to resolve the dispute without anyone losing their property rights, they might be willing to extend the deadline to allow for a proper resurvey. What about the surveying itself? Asked Jennifer. Can we get a professional surveyor to redo the boundary measurements using the historical creek location as a reference point? I'm already on it, said Thomas from Phoenix. Margaret here knows a surveyor who specializes in historical boundary disputes. He's worked on cases where natural features were used as original reference points. She's calling him now. As the morning progressed, the legal team executed a carefully coordinated plan. Michael Patterson contacted the executives at Meridian Corporation, the representatives of the Tohono-O'odham Nation, and the city of Phoenix, explaining the discovery of the historical creek and requesting a temporary extension of the deal deadline to allow for proper resurveying. The response from all three parties was cautiously optimistic. None of them wanted to enter into years of litigation over the property dispute. If there was a solution that could preserve everyone's legitimate property rights, they were willing to consider it. By noon, a professional surveyor named Robert Chun, no relation to Sarah, was on site in Phoenix with ground-penetrating radar equipment, historical survey documents, and the original engineering drawings that showed Salt Creek's path. His preliminary assessment confirmed what the legal team had hoped. Using the creek's former location as a reference point, he could establish where the original 1924 boundary should have been drawn. The results were surprising but logical. The 2-acre property that had been the subject of the dispute didn't actually belong entirely to any one of the three claimants. Instead, the correct boundaries showed that Meridian Corporation owned about 1.2 acres, the city owned about 0.6 acres, and the tribal land included about 0.2 acres. More importantly, the resurvey showed that the areas each party had been using and improving over the decades generally corresponded to their actual ownership under the corrected boundaries. Meridian had been maintaining and paying taxes on the land they actually owned. The city had been providing services and installing infrastructure on the land they actually owned. The tribe had been conducting ceremonies on the land they actually owned. It's almost like everyone unconsciously recognized the correct boundaries, Robert Chun observed as he completed his survey. Even without knowing about the creek, people's actual use of the land followed the natural divisions that the creek would have created. By 2 p.m., Thomas was back on a plane to New York with a full set of corrected survey documents, historical evidence, and legal descriptions that accurately reflected each party's ownership. The legal team spent the remaining afternoon preparing formal agreements that would acknowledge the resurveying results and allow the Meridian Corporation deal to proceed with clear title to their portion of the property. At 5:47 p.m., just 13 minutes before their deadline, the agreements were signed. The $2.8 billion deal was saved. All three parties retained clear title to their respective portions of the property, and a 90-year-old boundary error was finally corrected. Marcus Williams arrived for his regular shift at 11 p.m. on Friday night, just as he had every weeknight for the past 7 years. He pushed his cleaning cart off the service elevator on the 42nd floor, expecting to find the conference room finally empty after the lawyer's week-long marathon session. Instead, he was surprised to see lights still on and several people gathered around the table. But this time, the scene was completely different. Instead of the frantic energy and scattered papers that had characterized the past week, the conference room had an atmosphere of celebration. The lawyers were standing around talking and laughing, with champagne glasses in their hands and genuine smiles on their faces for the first time Marcus had seen all week. "Marcus," called out Sarah Chun as soon as she saw him. "Perfect timing. We were hoping you'd get here before everyone left." "Is everything okay?" Marcus asked, unsure why the lawyers seemed so happy to see him. "Do you need me to come back later?" "Actually, we need you to come in here," said Michael Patterson, gesturing toward the table. "We have something important to tell you." Marcus parked his cleaning cart and entered the conference room, feeling a bit awkward about interrupting what was obviously some kind of celebration. "I hope the case worked out all right for you folks." "Marcus," said Jennifer Walsh, grinning broadly. "The case worked out perfectly. And it's entirely because of you." "Because of me? I don't understand. I just mentioned something about those maps looking different." David Rodriguez stepped forward, holding a folder full of documents. "That's something you mentioned saved a $2.8 billion deal." Your observation about the creek led us to discover that property boundaries in downtown Phoenix had been wrong for 90 years. We were able to resolve the ownership dispute, save our client's hotel acquisition, and prevent years of litigation. Marcus stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what he was hearing. You mean that thing about the squiggly lines on the map actually helped? It didn't just help, said Thomas Kim, who had returned from Phoenix that afternoon. It solved the entire case. There really was a creek running through that property in the 1920s, just like you thought. When the city buried it in 1926, every subsequent survey was based on incorrect boundary information. We spent 6 days examining every possible legal angle, added Lisa Martinez, and we never thought to question whether the physical boundaries might be wrong. It took someone with your military mapping experience to spot what we had missed. Marcus shook his head in amazement. I still can't believe it. I just noticed the lines didn't match up. It reminded me of some problems we had in Vietnam with outdated maps. Well, that experience just saved one of the most complex real estate deals in corporate history, said Michael Patterson. Which brings us to why we wanted to talk to you tonight. Sarah Chen picked up an envelope from the table. Marcus, we know that your observation made the difference between success and failure on this case. We also know that you've been working here for 7 years, and you've always been professional, reliable, and respectful. Tonight, you proved that you're also observant, thoughtful, and capable of insights that escape 10 experienced lawyers. We talked about this among ourselves, continued Michael, and we decided that a simple thank you wasn't nearly enough. So we've done something that's never been done in the history of this law firm. Marcus felt his heart beating faster, unsure what was coming next. Marcus, said Jennifer Walsh, we've prepared a consulting fee agreement for your contribution to this case. When major cases succeed, the lawyers involved receive significant bonuses. We believe you deserve the same recognition. Sarah handed Marcus the envelope. We've also spoken with our client, Meridian Corporation. Their CEO was so impressed with your story that they want to offer you something as well. With trembling hands, Marcus opened the envelope. Inside was a check that made him blink several times to make sure he was reading the numbers correctly. It was for $50,000. This can't be right, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is more money than I make in 2 years. It's exactly right, said David firmly. Your insights saved our client hundreds of millions of dollars in potential litigation costs, not to mention the value of the deal itself. $50,000 is actually a conservative percentage of the value you created. But that's not all, added Thomas, clearly enjoying Marcus's shock. I spoke with James Morrison, the CEO of Meridian Corporation, this afternoon. He was amazed that the solution came from someone with military experience and practical map reading skills. Meridian has extensive real estate holdings across the country, and they often run into complex boundary and surveying issues. Michael Patterson smiled. Marcus, if you're interested, Meridian Corporation would like to offer you a position as a consulting surveyor and property analyst. They want to hire you to review their property holdings for exactly the kind of historical boundary issues you identified in our case. Marcus had to sit down. The information was too much to process all at once. You're saying they want to give me a different job? A much better job, said Jennifer. The position pays $75,000 a year, plus benefits, plus consulting bonuses for cases like this one. You'd be reviewing property documents, identifying potential boundary disputes, and working with professional surveyors to resolve title issues. But I don't have any formal education in surveying or law, Marcus protested. You have something better, said Sarah. You have practical experience, attention to detail, and the ability to see things that formally trained experts miss. That combination is incredibly valuable. Lisa Martinez handed Marcus another document. We've also arranged for you to take some continuing education courses in property law and modern surveying techniques. Meridian will pay for the training, and you'll attend classes during work hours. I don't know what to say, Marcus said, staring at the check and the job offer. There's one more thing, said Michael. We've spoken with our managing partners about establishing a new protocol for complex cases. We want to create a fresh eyes review process where people from different backgrounds and with different kinds of experience can examine our evidence and offer their perspectives. You're changing how the law firm works? Marcus asked. We're recognizing that expertise comes in many forms, explained David. Legal training is important, but so is practical experience, attention to detail, and the ability to ask questions that haven't been asked before. We almost lost a major case because we were too narrow in our thinking. Jennifer Walsh raised her champagne glass. Marcus, you taught us something important about the value of different perspectives. We want to make sure we never make that mistake again. As the lawyers toasted their success and Marcus's contribution, the conversation turned to how the case had unfolded and what lessons could be learned from it. The thing that amazes me, said Thomas, is how many experts examined those survey maps without noticing what Marcus spotted in 5 minutes. We were looking at the legal implications, reflected Sarah. We were so focused on ownership claims and court precedents that we never questioned the basic assumption that the property boundaries were correctly mapped. It's like the parable of the wise men and the elephant, added Lisa. Each expert was examining one part of the problem in great detail, but nobody stepped back to look at the whole picture. Marcus, who was beginning to recover from his shock, had a question. How often does this kind of thing happen? I mean, property boundaries being wrong because of changes to the land. More often than you might think, said David, especially in areas that were surveyed in the early 1900s, when natural features like creeks and ridgelines were commonly used as boundary markers. As cities developed and natural features were altered, a lot of property descriptions became inaccurate. That's exactly why Meridian wants to hire you, explained Michael. They have hundreds of properties in their portfolio, many of them acquired through complex chains of ownership going back decades. They need someone who can identify potential boundary problems before they become major legal disputes. Your military experience with map reading and terrain analysis gives you skills that most property lawyers don't have, added Jennifer. Combined with your attention to detail and your willingness to ask questions, that makes you exactly the kind of person they need. As the evening progressed, Marcus learned more about his new opportunity. He would be working directly with Meridian's legal department, reviewing property documents for potential issues. He would also work with professional surveyors and title companies to investigate any discrepancies he identified. The job would involve some travel, as Meridian had properties in over 20 states. The best part, said Thomas, is that you'll be preventing these kinds of crises instead of trying to solve them at the last minute under deadline pressure. And you'll be working with a team that values your insights, added Sarah. No more being invisible. Your observations and questions will be central to what you do. By the time Marcus left the law firm that night, his entire life had changed. He had a check for $50,000 in his pocket, a job offer that would more than triple his salary, and the knowledge that his simple observation had saved a multi-billion-dollar deal. But, perhaps more importantly, he had learned something about the value of his own experience and perspective. For years, he had felt invisible in the corridors of Davidson, Pierce and Associates, respected but unnoticed, appreciated but not truly valued. Now he understood that his background, his military training, his practical experience, his careful attention to detail, represented a form of expertise that was just as valuable as any law degree. As Marcus rode the subway home to Queens that night, he thought about his granddaughter, who was studying engineering at community college. He could now help pay for her education, maybe even help her transfer to a 4-year university. He thought about his late wife, who had always encouraged him to believe in his own abilities even when others overlooked him. But, mostly, he thought about how a simple observation, noticing that 2 maps didn't quite match up, had changed everything. It was a reminder that solutions to complex problems could come from anywhere, and that sometimes the most important insights came from people who approached problems from completely different angles. The lawyers at Davidson, Pierce and Associates had learned that lesson 6 months later. Marcus Williams sat in a conference room on the 38th floor of the Meridian Corporation building in Manhattan, reviewing property documents for a complex acquisition in Colorado. The room was bright and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of Central Park. It was a far cry from the night shift cleaning routine that had been his life for 7 years. Marcus now wore business casual clothes instead of a janitor's uniform. His desk was equipped with a high-end computer, professional surveying software, and direct access to property databases across the country. His business cards read Senior Property Analyst, and his opinions were actively sought by lawyers, surveyors, and real estate executives who had learned to value his unique perspective. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Marcus had spent his first month at Meridian in intensive training, learning about modern surveying techniques, property law basics, and the software systems used for analyzing land records. He had discovered that his military experience had given him a solid foundation for understanding coordinate systems, topographical analysis, and document review procedures. More importantly, he had learned that his instinct for spotting discrepancies and asking practical questions was exactly what Meridian needed. In his first 6 months on the job, Marcus had identified potential boundary issues in 12 different properties, preventing what could have been millions of dollars in litigation costs. The Colorado case he was working on reminded him of the Phoenix hotel deal that had changed his life. Meridian was acquiring a ski resort that included several parcels of land with ownership histories dating back to the 1880s. The property had been surveyed multiple times over the decades, and Marcus had noticed inconsistencies in the boundary descriptions that suggested potential problems. The east boundary of Parcel 7 shows different coordinates in the 1924 survey versus the 1967 survey. Marcus explained to Jennifer Walsh, who now worked as Meridian's senior counsel for property acquisitions. Jennifer had left Davidson, Pierce & Associates 3 months earlier to join Meridian's legal team, partly because she was impressed with the fresh perspectives that Marcus brought to complex cases. "How significant is the difference?" Jennifer asked. "About 40 feet in some places. But here's what's interesting." Marcus pulled up a historical topographical map on his computer screen. According to the Geological Survey, there used to be a natural hot spring in that area. The original 1880s surveys mention it specifically as a boundary marker. Jennifer leaned forward, recognizing the pattern. "Let me guess, the hot spring was developed or capped sometime between the early surveys and the later ones." Exactly. The hot spring was incorporated into the ski resort's facilities in 1963. They built a spa building over it and rerouted the natural flow underground. Every survey after that had to estimate where the original boundary should be, and they estimated wrong by about 40 feet, which happens to be exactly where the current ownership dispute is focused. Jennifer smiled. "So we're looking at the same kind of problem you identified in Phoenix. Property boundaries based on natural features that were later altered by development." "That's my assessment. I'd recommend getting a specialized survey done that takes the original hot spring location into account before we finalize this acquisition." "I'll arrange it. This could save us another major headache down the line." As Jennifer left to coordinate the survey work, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that night when he had noticed the squiggly lines on an old map. The work was intellectually challenging in ways he had never experienced before. Every case was like solving a puzzle, requiring him to piece together historical information, geographical data, and legal documents to identify potential problems. But the most satisfying part of his new career was the respect he received from his colleagues. His insights were valued, his questions were taken seriously, and his recommendations influenced major business decisions. For someone who had spent most of his working life being invisible, the change was profound. Marcus's success had also created ripple effects throughout the industry. Word had spread about the janitor who had solved the Phoenix hotel case, and other real estate companies had begun to recognize the value of bringing different perspectives to complex property disputes. Several firms had hired people with military mapping experience, historical research backgrounds, or practical surveying skills to review their property portfolios. Davidson, Pierce & Associates had formalized their fresh eyes review process, bringing in consultants from various backgrounds to examine evidence in major cases. The approach had already proved valuable in several subsequent cases, helping the firm identify solutions that purely legal analysis had missed. The story had also gained attention in legal and business publications. Marcus had been profiled in Real Estate Weekly, and the case had been written up in the Harvard Law Review as an example of how cognitive bias could blind experts to obvious solutions. The articles emphasized how Marcus's outsider perspective and practical experience had been more valuable than years of specialized legal training. But for Marcus personally, The most meaningful changes were in his family life. He had been able to help his granddaughter Ashley transfer from community college to Columbia University, where she was studying civil engineering with a focus on surveying and mapping technologies. She often called her grandfather for advice on her coursework, and Marcus took great pride in being able to help her with technical questions. He had also been able to move from his small apartment in Queens to a comfortable two-bedroom place in Brooklyn, closer to where Ashley lived. For the first time in years, he felt financially secure and optimistic about the future. One afternoon in late spring, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from Sarah Chun, who was still working at Davidson, Pierce & Associates but had been promoted to senior partner following the success of the Phoenix Hotel case. "Marcus, I have an interesting proposition for you," Sarah said. "We're working on a case that involves disputed property boundaries in 6 different states, all related to railroad land grants from the 1870s. It's incredibly complex, and we think you might be able to spot patterns that we're missing." "What kind of patterns?" Marcus asked. "The railroad companies used different surveying methods in different states, and some of the land grants overlapped with Native American treaty boundaries and state territorial claims. We have lawyers specializing in railroad law, federal Indian law, and territorial history, but we can't seem to reconcile all the different boundary descriptions." Marcus felt the familiar excitement that came with a new puzzle to solve. "Are there historical maps showing the original railroad routes?" "Dozens of them. But they don't all agree with each other, and some of them seem to contradict the legal descriptions in the land grants." "Sounds like my kind of problem. When do you need an answer?" "We're under a tight deadline again, but not as tight as last time. We have 2 weeks instead of 2 hours." Marcus laughed. "That's practically luxurious compared to the Phoenix case. Send me the documents, and I'll take a look." As Marcus reviewed the railroad case materials over the following week, he found himself applying the same systematic approach that had worked in Phoenix and Colorado. He started by looking for discrepancies between different surveys, then researched what physical features might have existed when the original boundaries were established. The railroad case proved to be even more complex than the Phoenix Hotel deal. Marcus identified 3 different natural features, 2 rivers, and a mountain ridge that had been used as boundary markers in the 1870s but had been significantly altered by later development. One river had been dammed and its course changed, another had been diverted for mining operations, and the mountain ridge had been partially leveled for a highway construction project. But Marcus also noticed something that the legal team had overlooked. The railroad land grants had been surveyed using different coordinate systems in different states, because the surveying standards hadn't been fully standardized in the 1870s. When later surveys tried to reconcile the boundaries, they had failed to account for the differences in coordinate systems, creating systematic errors that compounded over time. Marcus's analysis led to a solution that satisfied all parties involved in the dispute. By correcting for the coordinate system differences and accounting for the altered natural features, surveyors were able to establish the true boundaries of each railroad land grant. The case was settled out of court, saving the parties involved an estimated $10 million in litigation costs. As word of Marcus's latest success spread, he began receiving consulting requests from law firms, real estate companies, and government agencies across the country. He was invited to speak at conferences about property law and historical surveying. Universities began incorporating his case studies into their curricula for law students and surveying professionals. But Marcus remained grounded in the practical approach that had made him successful. He never forgot that his greatest strength was his willingness to ask simple questions and notice details that others overlooked. One evening, as Marcus was finishing up work on a boundary dispute case in Texas, he received a call from Ashley. She had just completed her junior year at Columbia and was calling to share some exciting news. "Grandpa, you'll never guess what happened. Professor Martinez assigned your Phoenix Hotel case as a study project for our surveying class. When I told her you were my grandfather, she invited you to come speak to our class about the importance of historical research in modern surveying." Marcus smiled. "I'd be honored to speak to your class. What would you like me to talk about?" "Just tell them your story. Tell them how you solved a case that 10 lawyers couldn't solve, just by paying attention to details and asking the right questions." I think the real lesson is that everyone has something valuable to contribute if given the chance. I was lucky that those lawyers listened to me instead of dismissing my observations. That's exactly the kind of thing our professor wants students to hear. She says too many surveyors get tunnel vision and stop questioning their assumptions. After ending the call with Ashley, Marcus walked to the window of his Brooklyn apartment and looked out at the city lights. He thought about how dramatically his life had changed since that night when he had noticed the discrepancy in those old survey maps. The transformation hadn't just been about money or career advancement, though those improvements were certainly meaningful. More importantly, it had been about recognition, the recognition that his experience, his perspective, and his insights had value, that his careful attention to detail and his willingness to ask questions could make a difference in solving complex problems. Marcus had learned that expertise came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important contributions came from people who approached problems from completely different angles. His military experience with maps and coordinates, his years of careful observation and attention to detail, and his outsider's perspective on legal problems had combined to create a unique skill set that was valuable in ways he had never imagined. The story of the janitor who solved the lawyer's case had become more than just an interesting anecdote. It had become a reminder of the importance of listening to everyone's insights, of questioning assumptions, and of recognizing that the next great solution might come from the most unexpected source. And, as Marcus prepared for bed that night, he felt grateful not just for the opportunities that had come his way, but for the chance to prove that wisdom and insight weren't the exclusive property of people with advanced degrees and corner offices. Sometimes the most important observations came from people who simply paid attention to the world around them and weren't afraid to point out when something didn't quite add up. The squiggly lines on an old map had changed everything. But, more than that, they had proven that in a world of complex problems, simple observations could still make all the difference, too. And they were determined never to forget it. But the biggest surprise came that evening, when the legal team gathered to celebrate their success. Michael Patterson made an announcement that shocked everyone in the room. "I've been practicing law for 35 years, he said, and I've never seen a case resolved by someone who wasn't even part of the legal team. Marcus Williams saved this deal with one simple observation that none of us were smart enough to make. Which is why," added Sarah Chun, "we've decided that Marcus deserves a lot more than just our thanks." The lawyers had pooled their resources to do something unprecedented in the law firm's history. But what they planned would change not just Marcus's life, but also how they approached complex problems in the future. The solution to their biggest case had come from the most unexpected source imaginable, and they were determined to make sure Marcus Williams knew just how much his insight had meant, not just to their client, but to everyone involved in the case. Meanwhile, Marcus Williams continued his quiet work throughout the rest of the building, unaware that his simple observation had potentially saved a $2.8 billion deal. He cleaned offices, mopped floors, and emptied trash cans, just as he did every night. But, for the first time in his 7 years at Davidson, Pierce and Associates, his work might have extended far beyond maintaining the building. As dawn approached, and Marcus finished his shift, the lawyers were still in the conference room, energized by their new research direction. They had spent 6 days running in circles, exploring every legal avenue they could think of. Now they had a completely different approach to consider, one that focused not on competing legal claims, but on the fundamental question of whether the property boundaries had been correctly identified in the first place. It was, as Sarah would later reflect, a perfect example of how sometimes the most complex problems have surprisingly simple solutions. But only if you're looking at them from the right angle. And sometimes the right angle comes from the most unexpected source. The morning would bring new challenges as the lawyers raced against their deadline to research Marcus's Creek theory. But, for the first time all week, they felt like they were on the right track. They had a concrete lead to follow, a specific question to answer, and a clear path forward. Whether that path would actually solve their ownership crisis remained to be seen. But, thanks to a janitor's careful eye and military-trained attention to detail, they now had a fighting chance to save the deal, and to learn something important about the value of listening to everyone's observations, regardless of their job title or educational background. The real test would come when they started making phone calls and visiting archives. The historical records would either confirm Marcus's theory about the creek, or they would be back to square one with less than 12 hours until their deadline. But at least now they had hope. And sometimes hope is all you need to find the energy to keep fighting. Backslashing up a bit. Should I come back later? Sarah looked up from her documents, her eyes taking a moment to focus. Oh, hi, Marcus. No, that's fine. We'll be here all night anyway. Come on in. Marcus had been cleaning their conference room for years, and the lawyers had always been courteous to him. They knew his name, they asked about his granddaughter occasionally, and they always thanked him for his work. He appreciated that they treated him with respect, unlike some of the other businesses where he had worked. As Marcus began emptying the overflowing wastebaskets, he couldn't help but notice the massive amount of paperwork covering every surface. Maps, charts, legal documents, and photographs were spread out like pieces of a giant jigsaw puzzle. His eyes, trained from years of military map reading, automatically began to process the visual information. The lawyers continued their discussion as Marcus worked quietly around them. They were debating something about survey coordinates and property boundaries, about tribal treaties and municipal deeds. Marcus had heard enough over the years to understand that they were dealing with some kind of ownership dispute that was threatening a major business deal. As he cleaned, Marcus noticed something that seemed odd. One of the maps on the table showed a piece of land in Phoenix with very specific boundaries marked in different colors. But there was another map next to it, what looked like a much older survey map, that showed the same area with slightly different markings. Marcus paused in his cleaning, studying the maps more carefully. His military training had taught him to read surveys and understand coordinate systems, and something about these maps didn't quite match up. The coordinates were the same, but the actual boundary lines seemed to be drawn differently. The lawyers were too exhausted and too focused on their legal theories to notice Marcus's interest in their documents. They continued their debate about federal law and property rights and court precedents, unaware that the night janitor was examining their evidence with the fresh eyes of someone who had never seen it before. And that's when Marcus Williams, a man who had never attended law school, who had never handled a real estate transaction, who was paid to empty trash cans and mop floors, noticed something that 10 brilliant lawyers had missed completely. Something that would change everything.